Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial. And so it's fall, and fall colors are here. And we've got zinnias from Thomas's gardens, and we've got asters from the prairie, and so apples from Kerry's and vegetables from the prairie moon, blue moon. And so fall is here, and the gentian is out in bloom, and the New England aster, ironweeds, the grasses, the prairie asters, the silphiums, they're all expressing themselves as a genuine prairie. This is probably the best time to see a prairie in east central Illinois. Some of it is 10 and 12 feet tall, and it leans over, and if you want to push your way through it, you're going to have a hard time. It's seed collecting time, and you can milk grasses and work with seeds for the planting of areas that are ready for restoration or to plant a new prairie. But you've got to be careful that you not planting a September prairie, because it's easy to collect seed in September, October, November, and to forget about the plants that come early in the spring, the starry-eyed grasses and the hyacinths and those plants that are often hard to check because they are there for a moment, and if you don't flag them, you won't find them, and even if you do flag them, the prairie will come up around them and they'll be gone, and they will die off also, so it makes it hard to make a genuine prairie. But it's fairly easy when you have volunteer population to involve their seed in your planting. I will have 4-H people at Camp Creek on Friday, and we'll probably still be collecting New Jersey tea. There's a lot of fall mowing. We don't really enjoy a lot of fall mowing because it comes too soon. The New England aster, for example, is only just beginning to bloom now, and some of the mowing for fall has started on August the 1st. So there's a whole lot of prairie plants that don't get to be expressed. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but it's often a problem to work with mowing that when your species are gone. Okay, well, Ron Sleater came from Decatur, and we met at Wildcat Creek, which is near to Monticello, and their aim was to take a little knoll or a hill that's on either side of the creek, where we have taken out autumn olives in the past, but they have grown back. Autumn olives, as most of you know, are a very, very invasive tree species brought in by the Department of Conservation as a bird strip, put in between nursery trees, and then eventually used in restoration sites. They're not a large tree, but they're large enough to shade out the prairie plants, and the prairie plants will remain underneath, but the shading really destroys them some, and it also changes the pH or the acidity of the soil. So Russian olives, as they're often called, are somewhat of a menace. We'll put some link pictures up to show you what we do. We'll talk about lopping trees. You can use a fairly powerful lopper, but some of these trees, the branches are 1.5 inches across, so you almost need a chainsaw or a regular saw. We paint the stumps with Tordon, which is a systemic herbicide, and just only on the roots of that particular tree. We really have no other way of eliminating it. We sometimes encourage the people who harvest the seeds. There's a lot of seeds on these trees, and they make a pool that lasts for many, many years, so you have to be constantly removing autumn olive trees. But those berries can be harvested, converted into jam, and sold at the farmer's market. And we'll give you an idea of some of the plants that are surviving. They range from big blue stem to New Jersey tea to two types of liatris, one a gay feather and one a button liatris, quinine, baptisia, and we'll also let you see that if you do not burn this site and you do not prune the trees, you will get sumac. So sumac is coming back in. The link that we'll put up, it will be on somewhat adjacent to this program, and it will be oriented to taking out invasive olive trees. I've been a regular visitor to Lake Park because the silphiums and the grasses have overgrown the rather open trails that we have there and fall over, so you can hardly walk through. The talent is to remove those fruiting bodies and use them for seed and open up the trails so people can get through. It's very characteristic of a prairie for the plants to be supporting each other. So if you put a prairie plant out by itself, it will fall over in the long run. We have a problem that mowing people only want to go in two directions. They go from one end to the other and then come back. and each time they tend to want to take out items like ragweed. Ragweed by this time in the year is usually tall, about 5, sometimes 6 feet tall, and invasive on the edge of the mown territory. And if you mow it and disturb its roots and have an agronomic place there for more seeds to grow, the next year you're going to get more of them. So what happens to our prairies is that if that mowing persists in creeping in on the prairie, you eventually get a smaller and smaller prairie. Let me look at my notes here. So successive mowing from year to year should be discouraged, but it's very much a matter of educating people as to what the species are that they're mowing. And things like ragweed can be removed by a lopper. In the prairie proper, where there's not a lot of disturbance and the prairie is mature, there's very little ragweed. It's usually at the ends or around the edges where it occurs. Then we had some activity on the pocket prairie. There's a billboard at the end of the pocket prairie owned by Adams Billboard Company, and they've been very generous to allow us to have a prairie in front of the billboard, which is not ideal for billboard people because a billboard sells for more if it's mown. And at the moment, our dock at that location is probably best part of 10 feet tall, and the prairie has been very nice. We've had Brazilian musicians that were visiting WEF to visit the prairie, and so it's a place where we can show things off. The decision has been made to not have that billboard advertising lit up at night, which fortunately for us is very good, because a billboard that is alight all night means that the plants around it do not have their natural biorhythm. And so we thank Adams Company for allowing us to have a crazy prairie and allow it to be exhibited to the public, and including University Avenue traffic, which you can just look across there and see a prairie. I passed up the chance to say something about asters, but we might say that later. I went to, after doing autumn olive work, I came to the Camp Creek area, and I just must have hit the asters at the prairie asters at the right time. It was just a show of white right across the prairie, and I have some of it here. It's gone to seed now, but asters are not easy to define because there's probably about 70 different species of aster, and it depends on whether you're a botanical clumper or someone who sorts it out into many different species. It's kind of hard to know what the aster is that you're looking at. You need a guidebook, so I brought a guidebook. Its cover is kind of worn out because people have looked at these plants for years, and so that's a very helpful thing to have. And I bused to Staley Road. Kind of interesting. I took a bus from downtown Champaign to Country Fair, and then a bus that roamed around West Champaign and South Side Champaign, almost into Savoy territory, then back up to Staley Road. So I found that rather interesting. The Y is built there. You pass over 57. There are some new suburbs that have, instead of having speed bumps, they have gutters in the road that you don't exactly see, but they're a little softer on vehicles and the equipment that is in vehicles than speed bumps. So we got to Staley Road, and then I walked on the way back, mainly to see what was happening with the railroads, because we're interested in re-railing from Whiteheath to Seymour, and then we're hoping that a 3-mile abandonment between Seymour and Whiteheath might be resurrected so that we can get historic trains into Champaign. The organization that's doing that is the Champaign, Havana, and Western Historic Railroad, and they have been working this weekend to establish ties so that a group of railroad engineers can come out and get some on-hand experience with putting in railroad ties and putting rails on top of it and extending the railroad line to eventually get historic trains into Champaign. I keep running into people. I was taking books to prisoners. I take cardboard boxes. The cardboard boxes are interesting environmentally. They are the sort of boxes that are very strong, and they could be backloaded to the headquarters, but that's a pain, so it doesn't ever happen. So I take those boxes to the books for prisoners, and when they have a sale, they use those to allow people to accumulate a number of books, which are often very heavy, and the boxes have a second use. But really, those boxes are valuable and could be recycled by backloading. In the process, I ran into Belton Fields, and he'd been to Duluth, and reminded me that there was an artist there who had done a sequential piece of artwork where she'd taken a site, and when it was burned, she observed that site, and then gradually interpreted it as it grew. Bob Reaver in Paxton has done the same sort of thing. His son took photography and would do time-lapse so that you would see how certain plants grew by the year. And that's kind of interesting. Not everyone gets the chance to visit a prairie 10 or 20 times to do that sort of work. I went to the Kickapoo Trail to check it out. The sides of the ballast have been smoothed out with a backhoe that scrapes the soil. So it's at like a 45-degree angle, which we hope will have prairie on it in the future. The Champaign County Forest Preserve District is into that, and they've been collecting seed for that sort of restoration. It involves some thinking about where you put what. The roadsides are already planted to roadside seeds like brome grass and sometimes switchgrass, but that area will be mown. Then there's a little gusset, which is a sort of a bottom of a downslope and an upslope, and sometimes that takes on plants that like a little bit more water. So you have these are non-native plants often, like on the roadside. Purple gentian will grow, and then as you get nearer to water, Queen Anne's lace will grow. Both are rather interesting plants. Both benefit from mowing. And if I'm asked the question whether these are, how could you get rid of that long row of blue and white? And my answer is, well, just don't mow. It has a rosette of leaves, both the Queen Anne's lace and the chicory have rosettes that benefit from mowing, and so the more you mow, the more you're going to get it. And interestingly, it can be very beautiful if you don't come back and mow it at its peak of flowering. So there's some things that we can do with roadsides that are pretty interesting, and involves some rules and regulations that allow that sort of thinking. At Kickapoo, the prairie that's on a little side road that used to be the highway but is now retired is doing very well. Drains have been put under the railroad, and that allows the water to get away to the Salt Fork. The bridge has been completed, and it's not ready for use. The Forest Preserve is begging people not to get onto what looks like a finished product, but really it's not so finished. It's getting layers of crushed limestone that are a different size, so you get smaller and smaller, and you compact that. And if to have something like a bicycle or a four-wheeler on that territory, or even people walking, destroys that sort of settling down. It's settled down a lot with rollers of different types. Early on you use a sheepfoot roller, which has sort of like feet on it that really compact down, and then gradually you get to a roller that was like what you do when you put asphalt on the street. You roll it in, and it's very fine, and often with a vibrator, so that it really makes sure that this is a compact area that's good for bicycles. So I was looking at that, but I was also looking at adjacent territories. When we have bicycle territories, we like to have areas that are available even 5-10 miles away from the bikeway, just for interest's sake. And right close to this trail, there is a Pioneer grain facility which develops seed for the next year, and that is working as a harvesters in vogue at the moment. That factory is working full time. The semi-trailers that come in, interesting in that they have a little elevator built into the carrying area, so that you don't really have to dump and injure the seed by hoisting the semi-trailer up in the air and just dropping it into a bin. The little elevator pulls through the load and drops the cobs carefully, and they're dried so that they will be viable as seed in the next year. So that's the sort of place that might be off limits. It might be that we can interpret it, but I take a photograph of it, so just that you know about it. there's just up the road, there's a Fulls elevator, and at the moment it's loading grain rapidly, soybeans and corn, and it's right adjacent to the trail. The question is, can bicycle people enjoy understanding the workings of an elevator? You have to weigh your load. When it's deposited, you have to weigh again. You have to know your industry, your economics, and know whether you're going to store grain or sell grain. As a whole thing here that is of interest to some people who would like to know what happens with the corn and soybeans around their neighborhood. So I took a photograph of some of that activity, and then I went to Mayview, and there's a little cemetery, and I found the Fulls family and made a photograph of the Fulls family plot, which looks across the fields to the Fulls elevator. From a distance, somewhere near on Cottonwood Road, there is a John Deere factory, and it's not a factory, I mean a distribution center. And from that distance you can see the trail now. It's lost a lot of its trees, but you can see the area, and you can know where the prairie is going to be. So this is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial, and David is on the board, and so WEFT still needs your support. We're glad to do this, to take photographs of things like the autumn flowers and the prairie flowers that are around. And so now I want to say something about Doug DeLong. Yesterday I got a phone call from Doug DeLong. Doug DeLong is a county engineer in the Sullivan, south of here, and he has for a long time been very interested in planting native plants on areas that have been disturbed by county activities or by IDOT activities. And he has been asked to be on a committee at the state level to look at how we plan for roadsides that have vegetation on them. That's quite controversial because there is a neatness syndrome, and there's also a feeling that if you're going to have roadside vegetation, you're going to have roadside animals, and they're going to go out onto the road, and you're going to run into them and have an accident. That does happen. So if we're talking about planning, then we have to make sure that there is a downside to the ditch on the side of the road, which is mown. But on the upside, it's amazing what grows on relatively undisturbed soils. So Doug, being an engineer, has come a long way to know the species, and he was standing in a prairie talking to me and asking questions about New England aster, baptisia, culbus root, and he was using his cell phone. Cell phones are okay, but cell phones don't allow you to do a close-up. You can't change unless I may be able to. It may be that I don't have the skills to do that, but mostly when people are taking cell phone pictures, they're taking a long shot, and so you don't get the detail that you need. So there was what I suspected was rosin weed, but you have to have enough indication that you can see opposite leaves or whatever you have there. One of the problems with design of roadsides is that a major construction at the DOT, the Department of Transportation level, is that it happens about 8 years before things happen. Sometimes the process might be speeded up by some political action, but mostly it takes a long time. Sometimes it's slowed up because the road straightening might not be favored by the local communities, like between Atwood and Ivesdale. There was a wiggly woggly road, and for years people didn't like to straighten that road. Eventually it has been straightened, but the wiggly woggly road has been maintained, and most people use it, or a lot of people use that. So that might delay that 8-year period, but you have to find the subcontractors who are doing the planning, and by the time it gets to you, it's almost a fait accompli. You have to, you can change perhaps a driveway or some small piece, but basically the Department of Transportation will be coming to tell you what is going to happen rather than asking you what you might want to see happen. So when you're talking about seeding the adjacent area, you have to be there when the whips are cracking, and that's a long time before you ever see an inch-thick plan that's a music-sized paper that will go to the contractors. Doug was trying to figure out what sort of things he can contribute to this sort of thinking.
You know what? I didn't jump in at the halfway point when you did the station ID. You actually have in your notes for today that you are going to do a station break. If you want to grab a glass of water here, I've got a song picked out by Cozy Sheridan if you'd like to grab some.
No, I think I'm okay.
Okay, just keep right on going.
Yes,
all right.
But the station break is good because it lets people know
And I'll
who
just
we
mention,
are and what we are.
in case people are listening online, this was actually originally recorded October the 9th, 2016.
Okay. The things to watch for if you are on an Illinois highway, you are likely to be next to a railroad line because the roads paralleled the railroad line. And that means that when the road is widened, it's widened into your prairie. If the railroad line is 100 feet wide and you lose 25 feet of it, you're almost losing all of one side of the prairie that you had hoped to have. So widening, then you have to consider whether you're going to take it out of the farmland on the alternate side or keep the prairie. And usually the prairie loses out on the farmland. It may lose a little bit, but not very much. The prairie soil that comes from widening often has to be embanked up against the widened road, and so that prairie soil then takes on cultivated plants like bromgrass and the roadside plants that can be mown. So once again, you not only lose the plants that were in that 25 feet, but you lose the prairie soil and all its microorganisms. So the thing then to do is to look at the slope down, and that's what is mown, and look at the slope up on the other side towards the railroad bed, and that can include a very good remnant prairie or planted prairie. The difficulty is that it is mown by the statute, usually starting August the 1st. But August the 1st, the prairie starts off slow in the March and April, and gradually rises to a vegetative peak in June and July, with various flowering peaks. Then by fall, it begins to look like a prairie with, this year, grasses, big blue stem, Indian grass, switchgrass, little blue stem, cordgrass, Canada wild rye. These are all grasses that are wind-blown grasses. They're not the pollinators that are being talked about a lot. They're wind-blown. They have big anthers, and the wind catches that pollen and takes it on to achieve cross-pollination. The plants that you might like to be interested in most are often small, like our shrub New Jersey tea is no more than about 2 feet tall. And the spring herbs especially are short. Starry-eyed grass, probably 9 inches. Hyacinths, probably 10 or 12. So you need to think about what you will plant on the side of the road, on the upside. And then you have the conflict between people who feel that this is not neat, prairies don't look neat. And then also the problem that you have tall silphiums that might be 10 feet tall, and they lean over the ditch along the roadside, and then that is thought to be a place where deer can hide. Yes, they do, and they sleep in that prairie, and they can jump out in front of a car. So we have this conflict. But what do you do? Do you want to keep your prairie to some extent and provide people with an interesting view? If they're going at 70 miles an hour, they're not going to see the individual species, but they're going to get an idea of all the asters coming at the one time, or all the gray-headed coneflower, the monarda, all at one time. So there can be banks. You can have strong species like grasses in one place. You can have plants that sort themselves out according to the dry or the wetland. And now, how do you move that and shake that concept at the planning level? IDOT. The contractors are going to read their directions. So it starts with planning, and you have to know where the seed is coming from. Is this seed relatively native? Is it part of the gene pool that you have? Or does it come from a different state, which means that it has a different genetic background? It's over the years developed into a slightly different species. So then, as this plan is written, you need to know who are the seed distributors and where do they get their seed from, and how many seeds to the ounce. If you're planting switchgrass, for instance, it's a very, very small seed, and it's very viable. But an ounce of a switchgrass is not going to be the same as an ounce of some broadleaf plant that has a fluffy seed that's going to have a hard time competing. So then for the planters, you have to say, well, that downslope can have switchgrass on it. It can have a little blue stem, which is a diplomat. It can have Canada wild rye. But remember that when you plant that, that ditch slope is probably no more than about 4 feet deep, 4 feet long, and it's all sometimes 4 feet deep. It depends on where the road is and what terrain it's going through. But the point is that you need a tractor that is smaller than a 15-foot bush hog. 15-foot bush hog will move along that corridor, and because they're afraid of letting one of their wings flow over the road, they tend to mow the upside. So there should be some directions in planning documents to say that this needs a contractor with a smaller smaller tractor with a smaller mowing disc. You also need to sort out how the native plants might grow. The prairie plants can handle hard soil and dry soil. The cultivars and the weeds especially like to have everything nicely soft and moist. And what happens with contracts is that the edge of the road, when a new ditch is going to be placed a little further away from the center of the road, then it has to be resculpted. If you were kind to the existing prairie, you would sit a hi-ho on the roadside and you would scoop out the ditch, and you might only have to scoop out a couple of feet, and the prairie plants will remain there, and there will be adventitious buds that will allow the plants to grow back from their roots. The other alternative is much cheaper. You have to have, if you have 5 miles of roadside bed to deal with, it's cheaper to take a bulldozer and plow up the prairie that's there and then resculpt it. So you end up left with a very soft prairie that grows weeds, and it's very hard to convince the traveling public that this is a prairie. So if you're in the planning department, you need to think about how you recommend the job to be worked and what are the directions. So you can also improve the situation by rolling. If you do have to sculpt it and make a soft territory for plants that are very soft, then you can roll it, and that will encourage the prairie and discourage the weeds. And so we talked to Doug about that. He called me back this morning, and we talked about what is possible at the state and national level. One is that you have to realize that these are jobs. Mowing the landscape, contracting to build a landscape road are jobs, and that's a controversial issue. And So then you also have to know that the people who do the mowing, you would hope, would realize that there are alternative jobs that involve a knowledge of prairie. So you might want them to not mow behind a no-mow sign, but use a wire whip or have another member of the team come by so that you don't have to mow out a huge amount of prairie. You perhaps take that small tractor and make sure that it is safe, it doesn't roll over and things like this. So when you have a huge plan, you have to think of all these things, and it is slow to grow a prairie. So you're going to have to take 5 to 10 years before it will look like a decent prairie, whereas if you're planting brome grass or fescues on the roadside, they will grow sometimes within 10 days. They will be started, and within a year they will give instant gratification. So what things might you target at the planning level to suggest that planners do a little bit different with roadsides? So I found that conversation quite interesting, and we'll keep in contact with Doug DeLong. It's
10 minutes.
10 minutes. This is totally different, but I was listening to National Public Radio, and
We all gasp in disbelief. You don't just listen to WEFT?
so there was a Grateful Dead program, and Bob Weir was there, and I thought that was interesting enough because WEFT has had a Grateful Dead program for 30 years now, and mostly it's been run by one person for a long period of time, but it's got to the point that that gets to be a bugaboo. So the Grateful Dead program has been dropped, but it's still there in the annals of WEFT. And Bob Weir was a writer and a musician and worked with Garcia for many years. But he had an interesting background. He was the adopted son who left his adopted parents at the age of 15 and went to work on a farm in Wyoming, a ranch, where it happened to be owned by John Barlow, who later became a writer and an author with the Grateful Dead. Well, as he grew up, Bob Weir decided to find out who his biological parents were, and he found out that they were students at the University of Arizona in Tucson. And the mother had gotten pregnant, but went off to have Bob and didn't ever tell the father. So years later, he found mother and he found father, and spent years together. And I think that speaks to the generosity of people understanding each other and being able to find their biological parents, which you couldn't do a few years ago. And so it ranges from the Wyoming ranch to walking into a music store, and the music store was where Garcia was, and they got together and formed a jug band, which gradually morphed into the Grateful Dead. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And he's still writing. Bob is still writing, and he's produced a CD that is called Blue Mountains, and I think that might be because that's where his mother went when he was born. And, but people sharing their information like that is often helpful to others who are in the same situation. So a little bit of generosity there is very good. So I would encourage you to go out into the hinterlands at this time of the year and look at the fall colors, look at the prairie as it grows. Put on clothes that are a pair of jeans is pretty good, and good boots. I tend to use Wellington boots, especially if it's wet, but it also is a protection against ticks that might like to settle on your socks and go up your trouser legs. So a fairly inexpensive pair of Wellington boots I found rather helpful. Probably has something to do with not getting chiggers either. So, not to discourage you with the insects. There's like 2,000 insects there, and at this time of the year they're working on the fall too. They're storing their food, and you have to wonder how long they live. A bee who will perhaps live for 54 days or something like that, and how do they overwinter? Where do they overwinter? Are they in the soil like bumblebees? Are they communal? There's just a wonderful experience out there. Take a lens on a string around your neck. Take a pair of binoculars if you can't quite reach into a site. Try, if you're going to record something, to take perhaps the plant's leaves and flowers and roots. Think about the microorganisms in the soil. There are millions of microorganisms in even a spoonful of soil. And realize how hard it is to say this is what a prairie is. It has, over 10,000 years since glaciation, been modifying itself, especially the bacteria. They can encounter a challenge, and a new bacterium will, a sport or a mistake sometimes will allow that bacteria to survive in a different ways. So there's a dynamics here in the soil and in the plant communities. So it's very hard to go back and say this is what a prairie was. We have an idea of the indicator plants, like if I walk onto a prairie and it has lead plant and sculpus root and baptisia and things like that, then you've got a fair idea that you might have some sort of original soil, and especially if it's on a railroad line, it might not have been herbicided. So then you know that the creatures that are affected by herbicide, like native bees and the pollinators that people are into, are affected by that. So we cherish the remnant prairies that we have. So I encourage you to get out there. Sometimes you can sit in the prairie and you can hear the prairie sounds rather than the trains going by or the cars going by. Sometimes it's interesting to be out there in the mist when it's softly raining. Don't be out there when it's lightning, because that's how the prairies got to be used to burning. The lightning will have lightning strikes between clouds, but they also earth to the ground. So if you are the highest spot on the prairie, you too can be zapped by lightning. Early settlers had to learn that. Early settlers would lose their cows and their horses because they too were the highest point on the landscape. So watch your weather, but enjoy it. Watch it come in. Watch for things like tornadoes, but the weather is changing, and so there is a climate change. So we have to figure out what will happen to our prairie. Will the compass plant that is here not be as happy with the temperature and the rainfall that is here now, or the purple coneflower, which every once in a while is very, very strong? How will it adapt to the climate as it moves north? Think about glaciation, and think about that small rise in the ground that allows you to go up and over the face of a glacier, a continental glacier, which was dribbling water out and into a outwash plain like Flatville, that eventually was drained for good agriculture. Take your bicycle. Sometimes your bicycle, I think David's into the bicycle, and you see more if you're on a bicycle or walking. I think it's time. This is Dave Monk, Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 FM dial.
And Dave on the board. Speaking of bicycles, be careful out there on the streets these days. The squirrels are even stupider than usual. I intentionally aimed. I wouldn't have hit it, but I aimed toward one sitting smack dab in the middle of the street and finally said move to get it to leave Clark Street as I was on my way over here. It's that time of year. They're looking for food, so be on your toes out there on your bicycles, kids. And yes, the views and opinions expressed here are solely those of the speakers and no one else.